Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Smart Counsel for Lunch. My name is Sean Downing, and I'm an attorney here at the law firm of Samuel, Sayward, and Baylor, located right here in Dedham, Massachusetts. We focus our practice in the areas of estate planning, elder law, probate, and trust and estate administration. So this week I wanted to take a little dive into what happens to all your stuff when you pass away without an estate plan. Um, so first off, there's something called the beneficiary designation that I want to talk about. So when you set up an account, like a bank account or the big one's retirement account, you can select a beneficiary, a pay on death beneficiary. And the way that works is you write down a person's name, and when you pass away, all your stuff goes to that person, whoever you've listed, and it can be split between a couple people. It really depends on whatever organization, because this is asset specific. So each account, whatever the bank or other institution, how they like to do that. Now, this is the best benefit of a pay on death beneficiary is that it avoids probate, which I'll get to in a little later. But you don't have to go through the court. The downside is there's not as much flexibility, and it's sometimes hard to balance the numbers. For instance, if you have multiple accounts, they're going up and down. So retirement assets, they fluctuate, and if you have different accounts, some might fluctuate more than others. Bank accounts, for instance, you end up spending those towards end of life with like medical costs and everything. So it's hard to balance if you're trying to give to multiple people in multiple amounts. The second, and probably the more substantial thing, is there's no way to control of keeping things in trust or preventing someone from getting it outright. So, for instance, if you have an 18-year-old kid or grandkid or whatever, as soon as you pass away, they're 18, they're listed as the beneficiary, they're going to get all the asset, that money, whatever, right away, which is often not what people want, to give a lot of money to 18-year-olds. But that's just kind of the way it's set up. 18, you're an adult, and there's nothing stopping you because the beneficiary designations aren't really smart enough to do anything more than that. Now, let's say you don't have beneficiaries listed on your assets, or the person's passed away, or what have you. Everything else gets put into the big pot, and this is your estate after you pass away, right? And your estate goes through a process called probate. Now, probate gets, a bad rap for being slow and tedious in Massachusetts, and there's some truth to that. I won't say there isn't. But essentially, it's just a court process that takes all of your assets that are in your estate. So the big pot that takes everything in, that doesn't have the best beneficiary designation, is otherwise, through an estate plan, goes to someone else, like through a trust, for instance. But it takes everything that's in the estate and it transfers the name to a living person or persons or organizations, like a charity or something. But that process has to go through the court, and that's called probate. Now, if you don't have an estate plan, all of your assets go to people under Massachusetts's intestacy law. So intestacy just means if you don't have an estate plan. Now, most people think, oh, it's just going to go to my spouse or just to my kids. But there's some weird quirks that I wanted to get into of what actually happens given your family situation when you pass away. So let's start. Let's say you're married. You're married and you pass away and you have no children. Now, you'd think everything just goes to your spouse. But actually what happens is your parents, if they're still alive, get a cut. So your parents get a portion of it and the rest goes to your spouse. And the idea of that is, they want to make sure that elderly parents are getting taken care of, and assuming that your kids would want to help the parents. So they get a cut. Now, this is, might be fine, but the big downside is, especially if your elderly parent is on Medicaid or some other government program where the amount of assets they have is really important for them qualifying. Because if they inherit a big chunk of money, that could boot them off their program, and that could really mess up their life. Where, if it just everything went to the spouse, everything would have been fine. So that's something to think about in that situation with no kids. Now, if you do have kids, there's kind of some differentiation depending on whether the kids are of the marriage or like joint between you and your spouse. You're both the parents, or if there's any kids like stepchildren, or you had a kid from a previous relationship. If there's no stepkids or kids from a previous relationship, everything goes to the spouse, nothing goes to the parents. And then once the spouse passes away, everything just goes to your kids. So that's the most common situation, and that kind of makes sense for most people. But when we introduce the step kids and kids from a previous relationship, things get a little tricky. So not kid's situation, and you don't have an estate plan, your children get a cut. And that's in either situation. And the idea is um, the state assumes you want to benefit your kids equally and that your spouse would want to benefit their kids equally. So, even if it's, if you have a kid from a previous relationship, the idea is like, oh, the surviving spouse might not take care of them. So you want to give them a chunk of money. But even when you're not the one, let's say your spouse is the one with a kid, so you have a stepchild. The idea is your surviving spouse is going to want to treat everyone equally, or you want a little bit more going to your kids because that stepchild, is not um, technically your kid. And I mean, and this is just what the state is assuming, right? Like you might consider that stepchild yours or what have you. But intestacy law just kind of like tries its best at thinking what you might want. So your children will get a bit of a cut. It's less than if it's a child that's not the surviving spouse's, but they do get a cut, and then everything else goes to your spouse. Now, what happens if you're not married? If you're not married and you have kids, everything just goes to your kids equally. That one's pretty straightforward. If you're not married and you don't have kids, this is kind of the most classic situation. So then it goes straight to your parents. And then if your parents aren't alive, then it goes to your siblings. Your siblings aren't alive, it goes to your nieces and nephews, and it kind of goes down, like fountain. And if there's no great nieces and nephews, then it goes all the way back up and it goes to your cousins or aunts and uncles, then cousins, that kind of process. And that's how people, inherit things who are like distant cousins, because it eventually goes down the line and hits them. Now, a big thing that you should note is that does not include stepchildren. So if you pass away and you do have a living stepchild, but no living partner or kids, they get skipped over. And that might not be what you want. Also, partners get skipped over. So there's no common law marriage or anything like that in Massachusetts. So if you have a partner that you've been married to or not married, partner that you've been living with for decades and decades, they would get skipped over if you don't have an estate plan. So that's something to think about. You know, that could be a reason for you to get married, or it could just be a reason to come in to get an estate plan to just make sure they're taken care of after you passed away. So that's just a little bit of a little dive into intestacy law and what happens to your assets after you die. If you'd like to know more about any of this, or just setting up an estate plan and taking care of some of these things, if this is not what you want to happen and you don't have the estate plan currently set up, we'd love for you to stop by and yeah, we'll have a little chat about what we can do for you and go from there. All right, have a good one.